Hi there, and welcome to Game 4 of the World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Nxd4 Anand. We saw in Game 2 that Carlsen was able to show excellent understanding of the positional and quiet waters of the Spanish game. And today, Anand hits back against Carlsen's e4 by going for the obviously much sharper and attacking variation of c5 with the Sicilian. And the game continued with knight f3 e6, and by playing e6, black indicates that he'll be playing a number of different variations, which then Carlsen responded with g3, avoiding the theoretical battle that had been really popular over the last couple of years. So the game continued with knight c6, bishop g2, d5, e takes d, castle kingside, knight f6, d4, bishop e7. Now we have a typical Sicilian Carlsen setup now, and there are many ways that black can develop once he plays d5. And some of the most popular ones are as Anand has played here, but without playing knight c6, or for that matter, you can play bishop d6 and knight g to e7. This specific variation is a little bit more rare, but the character of the position doesn't really change at all. For instance, in this position, white played knight c3, castles, d takes c, bishop c5, a3, was played in the earlier this year. But instead of that, white continued with bishop e3, and then c takes d4. Now, before playing c takes d4, this was the first time in the entire game so far that Anand actually paused to think for a little bit. Even though the move was more or less forced, he was probably trying to evaluate the best plan for continuing after making the capture. So Anand played c takes, white answered with knight takes d4, and then here Anand plays bishop g4, which develops the bishop, while at the same time it develops it while gaining a tempo, because now obviously white has to deal with the threat on the queen, which is not really easy to do. But instead of playing bishop g4, for instance, Jones Carolina in the Reykjavik Open of 2012 continued with kingside castle, knight c3, bishop g4, queen d3. But in order to avoid that continuation, as I mentioned, that Anand played bishop g4, which develops and gains effectively a tempo, because now Carlsen has to deal with the threat on the queen. Now, an obvious threat to the queen could be handled, for instance, by playing f3, but f3 is effectively an ugly move, because now by playing f3, all of a sudden the e3 bishop becomes weak, plus your g2 bishop is now trapped behind the pawns and can't really get into the game at all. So by blocking the queen attack by playing f3, you've effectively weakened your one bishop and taken your other bishop out of the game altogether. And then all that Anand would have needed to do was swap off the dark square bishops, and he'd be then playing with effectively a bishop up. So that's definitely not the best way forward. So Carlsen played queen d3, which allowed queen d7, knight d2, castles, knight and 2 to f3, rook fe8, rook e1, bishop d6. Now what we have is that, let's just take a brief look at the position as we have it here. White has some active play, for instance, against black's isolated pawn, but in return black's pieces are very well placed. There's cohesion between his pieces are working together. The combination of, he's got a combination of bishops running on two strong diagonals, which give him a good space control, and what's more, he's got the option of playing rook to c8, which will then complete his development, and he's got very little to worry about from White's perspective in the short term. He'll be able to keep up some sort of pressure, so White doesn't simplify into an endgame where that d pawn will be the major weakness. So really nothing major to worry about here. The game continued with c3, h6, and queen f1. The queen didn't feel really comfortable in d3 as it was, and what's more, by playing the queen back to f1, it means that he'll then be able to play, for instance, the bishop to h3, exchange of the bishops, and then at least be able to deal with the pesky pressure that the black bishop on g4 is presenting. The game continued with bishop h5, h3, bishop g6, rook ad1, rook ad8, knight c6, b takes c6. And now that the structure of the position is starting to change, now all of a sudden that d5 pawn isn't looking nearly so weak, because it's now being backed up by the c6 pawn. And what's more, black really doesn't need to worry about the c6 pawn at all, because the c file is closed, so therefore there's no real immediate threat onto that c pawn anyway. So the white's only option is to quickly apply some pressure in the center, or he risks his position getting even worse. So immediately the thrust into the center goes with c4, bishop e4, bishop d4, which is a strangely annoying move for black, because it allows white to keep the equality. Black continues knight h7, which is obviously making preparations to jump to the wonderful outpost of g5. The game continued with c takes, bishop takes. Now here, for instance, c takes would have been a more natural type of move to play, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with playing bishop takes as what Anand did here. Now Carlsen exchanges off the rooks, queen d3, and the knight goes back to f8, which is obviously part of a rerouting procedure. The knight will be able to do much more for Anand towards the center of the board, and from that perspective he's now needing to reroute the knight again, which effectively gives up a little bit of a tempo, I suppose, and is a bit passive. But there's nothing really that Carlsen will be able to do, or White will be able to do really here, to be able to generate any initiative out of Anand's passive play. But then again, if there's one player on the planet that can produce and generate some sort of an initiative out of absolutely nothing, that person is Carlsen. But the game continued with knight h4, bishop e5, bishop d5, queen takes, bishop takes, queen takes e5, b3. Now, looking at the position as it is over here, is every trade-off makes the black's pawn structure with the c6 and a7 pawns a little bit more vulnerable. But having a vulnerable pawn structure and giving your opponent the opportunity to be able to do anything with it are two totally different things. Obviously, a goal of Anand's would be to effect some sort of an exchange whereby he'd be able to get that c6 pawn onto the d file, because then he'd be able to mount some sort of pressure as far as a good central pass pawn is concerned. Well, the game continued with knight e6, knight f3, queen f6, king g2, rook d8, queen e2, rook d5, which is a little bit of a sharp move, but then again, as I mentioned earlier, the goal that Anand was having was to be able to get that c6 pawn onto the d file to be able to generate some sort of cross pawn pressure, and this is exactly what he achieves here. Rook d takes, c takes, knight e5. For instance here, White could have, for instance, played queen e5, following the rule that a pass pawn that is far away from your defenses is a vulnerable pass pawn. Your pass pawn obviously become stronger and stronger, not only the further and further it progresses up the board, but at the same time your pass pawn becomes stronger if it is being supported by pieces. For instance, by playing queen e5 is threatening a queen exchange by way of, for instance, queen takes and knight takes, getting White's knight centralized onto the board, and effectively the White king will be able to head off the pawn relatively easily. And if Black doesn't exchange the queens by playing, for instance, queen d8, then all White needs to do is play knight d4, and as I mentioned, the d pawn is looking more and more vulnerable. But instead of doing that, Carlsen played knight e5, allowing queen f5, knight d3, knight d4, and here a brilliant little move from Carlsen, because he played g4, which under normal circumstances is a fairly almost natural type of move to play in this position. But now Black is facing three major decisions to choose from, and something that is not always easy to do when you are still 6 moves away from the time control and you have only 5 minutes left on your clock and it's ticking. But then again, at the same time, it must be noted that although Anand had 6 minutes left in his clock, Carlsen was down to 4, so it was getting really tight as far as the time control and time trouble is concerned for both players in this situation. For instance, knight e2 would have been a possibility with g takes f5 and knight c3, but because of the because of White's strong pawn structure, he's actually probably quite okay in this type of situation. So after g4, black played the queen back to d7, and queen e5, gaining some space. But black's pieces are still very well placed, and the white's king is now just a little bit vulnerable on its g2 square. And that vulnerability of the white king could allow for a little bit of counterplay, especially as the clocks are ticking down to the first time control at move 40. Black continues knight e6, king g3, queen b5, knight f4, and now an exchange of knights. With queen b4 check, king f3, and now black plays d4, which is effectively sacrificing a pawn, but he hopes the activity of the queen is effectively, quite obviously, he's sacrificing the f7 pawn, but he's hoping that the activity of his queen and the passed pawn sitting on d4 will give him enough to at least be able to draw the game. And obviously Carlsen isn't one to be looking at gift horse in the mouth, and obviously snaps up the pawn that's been sacrificed, and the f7 pawn drops. Now Anand comes down with his queen down to d2, which this move is actually forced, but at the same time the Anand would probably be have gotten to this move by way of a process of elimination anyway. Another possibility is, for instance, queen c3 check, king e4, d3, queen f3, and then it effectively means that the d3 pawn will be falling because of queen e1, king takes d3, queen b1 check, king e3. So the move queen d2, a strong move for black. White comes back with queen f5. Now here, very important, the king goes back to h8. How many of you would have looked at king g8 as maybe being a much more natural type of move to play? But the problem with queen, or the king going back to g8, is that it will be allowing white's queen to get back to the e2 square, and that will be problematical for black. And because white will be able to continue with queen b5 check, king h7, queen e4 check, king g8, and there the queen gets to e2, and that means that black no longer has any way of being able to make progress with that d pawn, which means the d pawn will probably be lost, and with that will probably be the game, because then white will be sitting with a pawn majority on both the king and the queen sides, and black won't be able to defend against both, especially if white forces an exchange of queens. So the king goes to h8, and white pushes h4, and from a practical point of view, white Anand isn't really worried at all that white will be able to win in a long endgame, simply because of the superior position of that d4 pawn, as long as black can prevent white from getting the queen back down into the e2 square, as I mentioned earlier, because that will effectively win the game for white. Game continued with queen a2, queen e6 to keep the tension, queen d2, the queen swings back into defense, and it's important to note here that besides swinging back into defense, that the g5 square is now covered as well. So why is that so important? For instance, instead of playing queen d2, if black had, for instance, answered with a5, that would give white the opportunity to play g5, a4 for instance. If he plays a4, then the queen goes to e8 and he gets checkmated. So, and a neat little checkmate by playing g5, g6 for the checkmate. So instead of a4, there's an h takes g5, h takes g5, a4, queen e8, king h7, b takes a4, and it's looking incredibly comfortable for white here. So instead of allowing any of those continuations to happen, Anand continued with the queen d2. As I mentioned, queen d2 at least covers that g5 square. So that meant that the white only had one option left to him, and that was to force the perpetual check, which Carlsen in effect did. And at this point the game was drawn, and they go into the rest day tomorrow with the match now once again all square, and Anand gets to come out after the rest day with the white pieces, and we'll be seeing that game on Friday. So until then, stay carved up for the win, and click the like button down below the video, share this out amongst your friends, and also down below the video as well is a huge red subscribe button. Click that as well, that way you can stay up to date on all these videos as I post them after each and every single game of this match. See you next time, take care.